So we're here to talk about treatment of soft tissue in a very, very overall sense, or in a very broad strokes manner. One of the things that we're going to do here, the reason I'm doing a bit of a setup, is just to have a brief discussion about early osteopathic literature. Now, in early osteopathic literature, which a lot of people like to examine for varying reasons, for philosophical reasons, for historical reasons, or for what I will call reproducible methodological descriptions. Now, one of the things that we have a challenge with in any instance of writing a reproducible methodological description is that to be accurate to what you need to do with words or with the written word is you need to use a lot of words. It works much better when you can show somebody. So that's why I will have a discussion and then show what I'm talking about or show what's being discussed here. So if we look at Dr. Still and his writings, what we come across, unfortunately, is a very strong lack of what we could call methodological or reproducible methodological descriptions. In Research and Practice, his final book, he did give some descriptions of methods, but he is well known to have essentially abstained from that, to abstain from telling people how to do things. Now, it's not that it likely didn't occur. It obviously did occur because he instructed people as to how to use hands-on methods to treat patients. That being said, we run into a concept that Dr. Still was the first osteopathic practitioner, and he had to learn everything through trial and error and completely on his own. So, with respect to the first person to ever do something, regardless of what it is, however they came to it, they are very likely to view that as the way to come to it. So to Dr. Still, to learn osteopathy, it has to essentially be self-generated. So that is at least one hypothesis as to why he abstained or had disdain for essentially teaching technical applications or technique. That being said, some of his contemporaries did write down what we could refer to as reproducible methodological descriptions. The first book in osteopathy wasn't written by Dr. Still, it was written by a gentleman named Elmer D. Barber. There's interesting stories that go back and forth between Barber and the Still family with legal battles and whatnot. We don't need to get into that, but what we can say is upon somewhat objective examination of Barber's work, there were acceptable or reproducible, acceptably reproducible methodological descriptions. So you could read his book and you could understand what was being said or how to do what they were talking about. So as opposed to just saying, there's tight muscles in the neck or there's constrictures of muscles in the neck and you need to relax them. He would say to relax them, you will do X, Y, and Z. Now, some people are against that and some people are for that. It doesn't really matter which side you fall on. But to have an understanding of how to do things, you need some insight. You can give people philosophy all day, but if they can't see it at least once or see some example of it, they're going to have a hard time thinking about it. And that's just the way the brain works. And we'll talk about that at other times, just with the fact of essentially encoding biases or encoding processes. It's important that you see at least something. The challenge becomes if you have a very hard time thinking something up or creating a method in your mind, you will think you're bad at it because you had a hard time, or you will think that there aren't any other ways to do it. So if somebody only shows you one way to do something, you will think there are not other ways because it's so hard to consider another way. If you're shown a concept over and over again and you're shown the concept looks like this here, it looks like this here, it looks like this here, this is what it looks like in many situations, and then what you're doing is you're encoding a process of understanding a concept and being able to apply it broadly. So what we want to talk about here, with all that rambling, is essentially the concept of looking at old literature and how they talked about working with soft tissue. If you look at Elmer Barber's book, again, the first book in osteopathy, which came out in 1896, he speaks about moving the muscles from side to side. Okay, that doesn't necessarily tell you in a very clear way what to do, but if you look to Charles Hazard in 1905, he speaks about working specifically across fiber direction with soft tissues. Now, working across fiber direction, essentially, if I hold my forearm like this, the majority of the muscles in the flexor compartment, the fibers are going to go this way. So moving across fiber direction would look like moving like this. Now, we can take that description of working perpendicular to fiber direction or at 90-degree angles, and we can expand that. Now, the concept that I've spoken about before as an overarching kind of heuristic statement or a rule of thumb statement is to is with respect to relational motion. So regardless of the structures that you're working with, one thing stays still and one thing moves in relation to it. So we'll show this in varying areas so that you get the concept of working perpendicular to fiber direction. But here, with respect to relational motion, to relate this to a concept that I've spoken about, is what I can do is I can keep the bones still, right? So the radius and the ulna still, and I can move the flexor compartment, the muscles grandly of the flexor compartment, against the radius and the ulna, or I can essentially hold this still, right, and move the radius and ulna in relation to the muscles of the flexor compartment. So either way, if I hold here and I move the bones passively as a practitioner in my patient, I'm working perpendicular to fiber direction. If I do this, I'm working perpendicular to fiber direction. I can hold, I can move, I can jiggle, I can shake, I can oscillate, whatever words you want to use, but I can do that. So what we'll do is we'll take that and we'll show it to you in multiple locations on a patient's body. But again, just to reiterate, what we're looking at is taking something that was written in the past and relating it to a concept that I've spoken about and that I've showed you, and also identifying the fact that if you haven't seen anything, or if you have a hard time thinking other methods up, then you will believe that there's only one way to do it. So we want to show you that there are multiple ways to do the exact same thing and multiple ways to apply the concept in many locations. And in doing so, hopefully give you the groundwork that you can take this concept, apply it wherever you need to, in whatever way you need to, and alter it in whatever way you need to, because you understand the concept and you understand how it can be applied in many different situations. So moving on from the concept that we discussed previously to demonstrate it as far as working perpendicular to fiber direction when considering soft tissues. Many of these things I might have demonstrated in previous videos, but what I want to do is just again provide some form of demonstration so that we don't have a conceptual talk with no form of essentially explicit processing or explicit learning where you see what we're speaking of. So an easy place to look would be essentially the muscles of the thigh, the anterior thigh. Now the fiber direction is generally vertical, so in order to work perpendicular to fiber direction with respect to the concept we're talking about, you can broadly grab around all the tissue and move it in relation to the femur. Now here, I'm just going to move this slightly. So here, I can do this, but you see, if you watch the leg's shaking. So what I would then tend to do is stabilize with my bottom hand, and I can, so relational motion here, again, we're talking about that concept, one thing moving in relation to another, and we're kind of joining that into the concept of soft tissue as spoken about with older osteopathic practitioners, or early osteopathic practitioners talking about working parallel or perpendicular to fiber direction. So to not move the entire leg while holding on to the soft tissues of the thigh, again in that perpendicular direction, I just simply stop the leg with my other hand. And now I can move the tissue in relation to the bone. So this way the bone stays still, the tissue moves. I can also hold the tissue still and move the bone under it. Right? So we still get that relational motion, but again I'm perpendicular to fiber direction. If I wanted to work perpendicular to fiber direction in and around some of the hip flexors, so rectus femoris, or even getting into a little bit of TFL, I can identify ASIS, broadly again, contact through here. I can work in that fashion. Very often it's useful to shorten a muscle or shorten or slacken a soft tissue before working on it. So if I was going to work in the area of TFL and rec fem and some of those tissues, I can place the knee into flexion, which places the hip into flexion, and I can again, very broadly, contact through here, identify the tissue that's firmer or the tissue that's not moving particularly well, so I can motion test it that way. And we're talking about relational motion again, so I can hold the thigh still and move, right? So I'll just change my hands a little bit here. I can hold the leg still and move my hand, or I can hold my hand on the tissue still, again, perpendicular to fiber direction. So those fibers are generally running vertical, although TFL is fairly vertical. If you're talking about glute minimus and medius, we're talking about slightly different angles, so it's not perfect. But I can hold this hand still and move the femur in relation to my fixed bone or into the hand that's on the tissues. As we move up the body, right, so I could do the same thing in the calf, moving perpendicular to fiber direction. With respect to the abdominal musculature, you can do a similar thing, recognizing that not all fiber directions are vertical, but if you're essentially on the flank, so between the iliac crest and the ribs, you can move through here. Same idea. So you can hold still again, same concept, relational motion. Hold the tissue still, move the bone in relation. Now, in a region like this where you've got a fairly open space where there isn't bone, it's covering organs, it ends up behaving a little bit differently. So I can move the bone below that these muscles attached to, or I can move the bones above, right? Because I only have two hands, I have to kind of pick a side. Just demonstrating the concept again. We move into the forearm, the brachium, or rather the antebrachium. So again, fiber direction is more or less vertical. I can move across it, so I can move the tissue itself while holding the bone still. I can hold the tissue still and move the bones. Again, we just continue to demonstrate the concept over and over again in multiple places. But with respect to the older or early osteopathic literature, speaking about working primarily perpendicular to fiber direction with respect to soft tissues, we can then plug that into our concept of relational motion to show how, with different words, we can achieve the same ends. Sometimes one concept is missing certain words where another concept has those words that allow for somebody to wield them a little bit better, to utilize them in real time a little bit better. But we take that concept that we discussed and we show it to you a few times. So now hopefully what you can do is you can start to sew these concepts together and make up your own motions, your own movements, or your own tests as is required by the situation presented to you with the patient that's in front of you. So you get, again, just use these overarching concepts. We will continue to provide as many demonstrations as possible to highlight it and highlight the similarities. So we're talking about the broad hand contact, or broad contact for multi-point discrimination, moving from the known to the unknown, get as much as you can touch. So concepts that we've spoken about with respect to palpation, relational motion. It might look like I'm just doing one simple thing and I can call it a technique, or I can essentially highlight some concepts that will guide all of those behaviors. So you sew them together and then you can begin to place them in any spot on the patient's body that is required.